I want to think for a minute about whether midlife crises, or maybe just crises in general, could actually help us find meaning and purpose in our work. So in this fantastic book written by the philosopher Kieran Setiya, he sets out several different diagnoses of midlife crises. And these diagnoses, depending on what a particular individual is going through, can actually help them find more meaning in their work going forward. So first of all, let's think about why a crisis might be a good thing to reflect about philosophically. Often, crises reveal an incompatibility in our attitudes. Now, it might be a practical incompatibility, right? I want to have a family that I'm really close to. I want to have a job where I'm at the top of my profession. I want to have plenty of time to go on vacation every week, right? Okay. These are not compatible. And a crisis might reveal this, right? So it might be a practical sort of incompatibility. It might also be theoretical. I might want to be the perfect father. I might also think I should be an excellent student. I might think productivity in our society requires that I work 80 hours a week, right? Again, these are also incompatible, but maybe they're not practically incompatible. Maybe they're just theoretically, conceptually, they're incompatible. So crises can reveal incompatibilities of this sort. And once you're in a position to see them, once they become explicit in your awareness, you can think really intentionally about how to resolve that incompatibility. Now here are the two moves that come from Kieran Setiya that I think are really cool and really helpful. So the first one, he says, look, if you're having midlife crisis, it might be because too much of your effort is being spent on what he calls telic activities. What is a telic activity? Telic comes from the Greek word teleology. It just means goal-oriented or goal-focused, right? A telic activity would be running a marathon. Why? Well, because you haven't completed the activity until you cross the finish line. There's a clear goal in mind as you're doing this, right? It might also be writing a report. Your goal in writing the report is to give this to the company's manager who's going to make a presentation to whoever. Okay, it's a telic activity. Setiya says, if you're only ever engaged in telic activities, your life is going to feel less meaningful than it otherwise might. He gives an example from his own case where he's a philosophy professor, right? And so he's a PhD student and he writes his dissertation, telic activity. He gets a job, telic activity. He publishes a bunch of papers and he gets tenure, telic activity. Even making enough money to buy a house for his family. All of these are goal-directed, goal-oriented activities. And he says in his life, there just wasn't this room for what he calls atelic activities. So if this is the kind of crisis that you're going through, if this is the kind of crisis you're thinking about, the solution, Setiya thinks, is to engage in more atelic activities. What is an atelic activity? Well, atelic relates to telic in the way that atheist relates to theist. An atheist is somebody who does not believe in God, right? An atelic activity is a non-telic activity, an activity that's non-telic. What could that possibly be? Well, remember, a telic activity has a clear goal. It's structured by progress toward that goal. So an atelic activity is goal-less. It doesn't have a goal, right? Think about walking in nature, and not because you want to hike and see all of the sights and check them off one by one, or because you want exercise, but just because you want to sort of meander, right? You just want to walk wherever your spirit leads you, wherever the kind of scenery directs you. You don't have a goal in doing this. Or think about reading a poem, and not because it was assigned to you or because you've got to read all of these poets in order to write your dissertation, but just because you want to enjoy the experience of reading that poem. Think about listening to jazz, doing yoga, meditating. These are characteristic atelic activities. And if your midlife crisis, if your work crisis is caused by over teleological sort of activities in your life, then maybe the solution is finding some atelic activities and building them in. Okay, but not all crises are going to be the same. And so Setiya offers at least one other diagnosis of a midlife crisis that you might have. And this one is super interesting because it depends on a new concept. Ameliorative versus non-ameliorative value. What does that mean? Look, some of the things that we do are good, but they're good only because the world is imperfect. So if you are a cancer doctor, you're a cancer surgeon, you're doing great work in the world. You're doing amazing things. But the reason that it's amazing is because the world's not perfect. In a perfect world, there would be no need for the thing that you're doing, right? The value is ameliorative. You're ameliorating something that's wrong with the world, that's bad, right? That we all would prefer not to exist, cancer. Okay. Now, Setiya thinks, and I think there's empirical research that sort of is consonant with this, that if you're always engaged in promoting ameliorative value, you are going to be more likely to burn out. So think about the really high rates of burnout in professions like teaching or chaplaincy or doctors, medical doctors, these sorts of things. And there are many complicated reasons why burnout rates might be high in these kinds of cases. But certainly it's not because the people in these professions feel like they lack meaning in their work, right? They have extremely high levels of meaning. They think like what I'm doing is deeply meaningful and important. Rather, it might be, at least partly, it might be because they're seeing things every day that if we lived in a better world wouldn't exist, right? There's a kind of moral injury. This is how psychologists talk about it. There's a kind of moral injury that comes along with that. It's exhausting, right? So if this is kind of the crisis point that you find yourself in, maybe the solution is to focus on promoting some non-ameliorative values. So what might that look like? Well, if you're spending 80 hours a week, volunteering, sort of, engaging in activism for a certain cause, and you just find yourself burnt out and exhausted by it, if you're in a position to engage in some sort of non-ameliorative value-promoting activity, then this could be the way to counterbalance it. What do those activities look like? Well, honestly, they look a lot like the other kind of activities that we just talked about, right? Doing yoga, reading poetry. You don't read poetry because you're trying to fix something about the world or even about yourself, right? You engage in that activity for its own sake. So even though these crises are very different, the causes might be very different, surprisingly, and maybe luckily, the solutions are actually quite similar. You want to engage in activities that are valuable for their own sake. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to make a connection between what Setiya is doing here and what Aristotle thinks about the point and purpose of all human life. So Aristotle says, look, we're all aiming ultimately at some goal, and he characterizes this as flourishing or as happiness. And he says, okay, the best possible goal, the best possible state we could be in is going to be a state that we prefer for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. So what does it actually look like to be flourishing in this sense, to be happy in this sense? Well, it would mean engaging in an activity that you are doing for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. Aristotle thinks this kind of activity is essentially contemplative. He thinks it's reflecting on the truth or doing things that allow you to do that, like dialoguing with a friend or reading great texts, even reading poetry, right? So Aristotle thinks that contemplation, the contemplative life, is actually the ultimate way that we will become happy. The connection here is that in either of the diagnoses that we were considering a second ago, in either of those cases, part of the crisis is that the agents involved, the people involved, aren't engaging in this kind of activity that is valuable for its own sake. So maybe the solution, or one way of putting it, is if you're finding yourself in one of these kinds of midlife crises, you've got to find a little bit more contemplation. You've got to make your life into what Aristotle calls the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life.